play. All right, everybody, welcome after a week off to another edition of Art Brunch. I was getting a little worried there that we wouldn't have a decent-sized group, but glad all of you joined, no matter what time it was. We are continuing our series on a focus on power, its wisdom and folly. And our inspiration is this gentleman right here, Niccolò Machiavelli. We're going to focus on Renaissance rulers, in other words, people of his own time. So I'm going to continue our series where we actually began. This striking portrait of Niccolò di Bernardo de Machiavelli is housed in the Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, Italy. In the first presentation of this series, I invited you to take a good look at that face and see if there was any hint of evil or malintent in that face. And yet, as you know, his name is given to an adjective, Machiavellian, which is defined as cunning, scheming, and unscrupulous, especially in politics. Now imagine if your name became an adjective with such negative associations. Now, to remind you again, Machiavelli was a Florentine diplomat. He was also an author, a philosopher, a historian, who lived during the Italian Renaissance, and he's best known for his political treatise, The Prince, written around 1513. He has often been called the father of modern political philosophy and political science. For many years, he served as a senior official in the Florentine Republic with responsibilities in diplomatic and military affairs. But like many Florentine intellectuals, he also had an artistic side. He wrote comedies, carnival songs, and poetry. But after his death, Machiavelli's name came to be associated solely with power, particularly unscrupulous acts to acquire and maintain power, the sort he devised in this work, The Prince. He claimed that his experience and reading of history showed him that politics has always involved deception, treachery, even crime. Machiavelli begins his book with the presupposition that there will always be people who seek power by any means necessary. He wrote, "It is not titles that honor men, but men that honor titles." For all of our history, both men and women have sought power. It is the perennial drug of addiction. And no civilization nor era is immune. Machiavelli did not question this, but sought a political philosophy that accepted this reality. Machiavelli believed that the public and private morality of a political leader were two very different things. Quote, "Everyone sees what you appear to be," he wrote. "Few really know, not who you are, what you are." Machiavelli believed that a ruler should be concerned, morally speaking, only with public perception, the ruler's reputation, in other words. Sometimes maintaining that reputation requires deceit. Machiavelli also believed that for a ruler, it was better to be widely feared than to be greatly loved. He says in The Prince, "Here a question arises, whether it is better to be loved than feared, or the reverse. The answer is, of course, that it would be best to be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely come together, anyone compelled to choose will find greater security in being feared than in being loved." Do you agree with that? You see, a loved ruler retains authority by obligation, while a feared leader rules by fear of punishment. In other words, effective rule sometimes requires the use of brute force, including the extermination of political rivals, if they threaten the prince's authority. This quote, I believe, captures well the essence of his philosophical worldview. It being my intention to write a thing which shall be useful to him who apprehends it, it appears to me more appropriate to, listen to this, follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. Follow up the real truth of the matter than the imagination of it. In other words, deal with reality the way it is rather than the way we hope it is or wish it would be. Let me continue. For many have pictured republics and principalities, which in fact have never been known or seen. In other words, he's talking about utopias. Because how one lives is so far distant from how one ought to live that he who neglects what is done for what ought to be done sooner effects his ruin than his preservation. For a man who wishes to act entirely up to his professions of virtue soon meets with what destroys him among so much that is evil. Let me explain in other terms. If you virtuously turn the other cheek in the face of your enemy, you will be clobbered because there are evil people out there. Machiavelli was a realist, not an idealist when it came to the subject of power. He wanted leaders to act the way life was and not how they wished it to be. Now take a look at this fresco. Excuse me. I couldn't help myself when I saw this fresco by Giotto. Apparently, Jesus might be the one who clobbered you, even if you were a repentant money changer who turned the other cheek. Excuse me again. So it is no surprise that Machiavelli's Prince has been surrounded by controversy since it was published. Some consider it to be a straightforward description of political reality, but others view the Prince as a manual for would-be tyrants. As we saw in the first two presentations in this series, Machiavelli studied the rulers of ancient Rome and the power of the medieval church, but he received most of his material and examples for his book from his own time period, the Renaissance. Who were the men and women who taught him about the wise and foolish use of power? Now, despite not holding political office in Florence, Cosimo de' Medici became the de facto ruler of Florence in the early 1400s by using his family's banking fortune to buy political influence. Cosimo's family bank was very successful, and he used the wealth to bribe politicians, control votes in the municipal councils, and secure political appointments. There is no other way to describe this than power through blatant bribery and corruption. But Cosimo, listen to this, also wisely used his wealth and power to support artists, philosophers, and orators, which earned him the respect of citizens and politicians. Cosimo wisely financed public projects, including the completion of the dome of the Duomo and the construction of the Palazzo Medici. Cosimo founded the first public library in Florence, which he filled with manuscripts that helped launch the Renaissance interest in classical works. Cosimo may have pretended to have little political ambition, but he sought complete control of the Florentine government, and he used deceit and generosity to gain and maintain power. Now, Cosimo's biography was well known to Machiavelli, but Cosimo died just before Machiavelli came along. So let's now look at rulers Machiavelli knew personally. In June 1498, Machiavelli began a string of ambassador positions, and over the next 13 years, Machiavelli assumed important roles under powerful rulers like Caterina Sforza, Pope Julius II, King Louis XII of France, Emperor Maximilian in the Germanic countries, and most significantly for the writing of the Prince, with Cesare Borgia, who sought power throughout northern Italy. Let's begin with the first, Caterina Sforza. You may recognize the name Sforza, a noble family most associated with the rule in Milan. Caterina Sforza was the illegitimate daughter of and I could mispronounce this, so I apologize, Galeazzo Maria Sforza, Duke of Milan, and his Mr. Lucrezia Landriani. When her father became Duke of Milan, she was invited to court, despite being illegitimate, and she was raised with all the advantages of royalty. She came to be known as an absolute beauty who was one of the most fiercely ambitious women in all of Italy. Now look at this portrait of her. Certainly a beauty, no question there. But what other traits can you see in that expression? Hold on a second. I have to admit Osnot again. She fell off. Well, let's see, where was I? Okay. Also, look at the title, The Lady of the Jasmines. In Renaissance art, jasmine symbolizes divine love and heavenly happiness. Divine love and heavenly happiness. Keep that in mind when we examine her character traits. She married the nephew of Pope Sixtus IV, Girolamo Riario, in an arranged marriage, and had her first child with him, get this, at the age of 15. She would have 8 children with her husband before he was assassinated. Riario served as a leader of the papal armies. As Sixtus lay dying in the summer of 1484, Rome descended into turmoil as various factions battled for control of the city, and Riario and his soldiers engaged in a reign of terror against his enemies. In order to secure her family's position, Caterina, who was then 7 months pregnant, rode on horseback to the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome. Many of you saw this when you were in Rome, and gained control of the papal castle, where, listen to this, she threatened the destruction of the College of Cardinals with the castle's artillery. What a brazen, audacious act, especially for a woman 7 months pregnant. After several days, the cardinals offered Riario money and assurances of his continued rule of the Emilia-Romagna region, that's a large area of northern Italy, in exchange for his immediate retreat from Rome. Caterina and Riario then packed up and returned to the city of Folly, where she eventually began to take over the governing of the city. But in 1488, a noble family in Forlì successfully arranged Riario's assassination, and they took Caterina and her children hostage. Her captors ordered her to persuade her soldiers to completely surrender. They took her to talk to the soldier in charge, but he refused to obey, not out of disobedience to Caterina or disinterest in her welfare. You see, before she was captured, Caterina had gotten word to her chief soldier that he should resist all pleadings for surrender. When the captors took her to the fortress again to negotiate, she tricked them into letting her enter the castle to negotiate alone. And once inside, she refused to surrender the fortress. Now remember this, her children are still being held hostage, and she still refused to surrender. Caterina Sforza is almost best known for her legendary response to an enemy's threat to kill her hostage children. Words that Machiavelli preserved for posterity. "Do it," she says, "if you want to. Hang them even in front of me," she declared, lifting her skirts. "Here, I have what's needed to make others." Now, take a good look at that expression again. Can you see an underlying fierceness, a wildness capable of sacrificing her own children to maintain power? Well, intimidated by Sforza's defiance, the captors fled without harming her children. Caterina then had her guards chase down the captors, torture them, before killing all of them. She was capable of extreme brutality in crushing her enemies. Now, Caterina spent the next several years acting as a regent for her eldest son, Ottaviano, who was too young to rule on his own. She wed twice more. When her second husband, Giacomo Fio was assassinated in 1495, Caterina also had those involved, as well as their entire families, tortured and killed. Now, when I was searching for information about Caterina, this image kept appearing. Apparently, Google believes this painting reflects her life and spirit. This statement from Machiavelli fits her personality well. Quote, "Whoever believes that great advancement and new benefits make women forget old injuries is mistaken." What do you think Machiavelli learned from the life of Caterina? Well, Machiavelli learned that if one wants power and to maintain power, one must be willing to do whatever it takes. And he also learned the value of deceit and brutal cruelty. Well, let's look now at religious power, this time with Pope Julius II, known as the Warrior Pope. That is exactly how the pontiff saw himself after taking the church's highest office. And as I mentioned to you in our previous art brunch, he most likely chose his papal name not to honor Pope Julius I, but to honor Julius Caesar. Now, since we already discussed him last time, I won't go into too much detail, but to say that Pope Julius II, above all, wanted to restore the Catholic Church's power and influence to its former glory. And to be fair to him, considering the volatile time, he really had no choice in being a warrior pope. Though notice how Raphael has portrayed him. He looks rather meek and mild to me. How about you? And now look at these depictions of the Pope. I think this bust and this engraving are more faithful to the true character of Julius II. He reigned during the Italian wars when many European powers were vying with one another for Italian territory. Julius II led a successful campaign using his papal army to capture the area of Romagna, and recall this had been the territory of Caterina Sforza. This fresco in the Raphael rooms of the Vatican is titled Leo the Great and Attila. Julius II commissioned it to commemorate the Battle of Ravenna, which happened in 1512, which he led personally when he forced the French to retreat from Italy. Pope Julius II also captured Bologna by leading a military campaign against the ruling family, personally entering the city and forcing the ruler to flee. What kind of pope does that? Despite being brutal and ruthless, Julius II used his power, like Cosimo de' Medici, to promote culture. He established the Vatican museums and initiated the rebuilding of St. Peter's Basilica. He also commissioned the Raphael rooms and Michelangelo's painting on the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Machiavelli observed that Pope Julius II's impulsive actions led to success because they caught his enemies off guard. For example, Julius I's campaign against Bologna succeeded because his invasion caught the Spanish and Venetians completely off guard. So here is a lesson in power Machiavelli learned from Julius II. Be unpredictable. Know any politicians now who are unpredictable? Despite the fact that everyone knew of the Pope's embrace of violent action for the sake of power, the Pope still aligned himself with the Christian faith. He had the audacity to present himself as a devoted follower. As you may accurately conclude when noticing the artist of this work, Raphael was Julius II's favorite marketer. We might prefer the term propagandist. He commissioned this Madonna on the left from Raphael as well to actually pair with his portrait. It is almost identical in size to the portrait, and on feast days they hung together in the church of Santa Maria del Popolo. Listen to this. The power of perception is a key point Machiavelli emphasized in his book. Julius II is telling the people, I may be a violent man, but I'm a devoted Christian man as well. During the years 1508 to 1510, Machiavelli served as Florentine diplomat to German Emperor Maximilian. During this period, the Holy Roman Germanic Empire descended as far as Milan, occupying lands that go deep into present-day Italy. So ensuring Maximilian's good graces, that was actually very useful for Florence. For Machiavelli, Maximilian is an example, though, of foolish power. In Maximilian's court, Machiavelli observes two things. Firstly, the emperor's habit of regularly changing his opinion. He isn't decisive, a necessary character trait for anyone who wants to gain or maintain power. Second, Machiavelli states that the emperor is, quote, too kind to his entourage, unquote, a sign of weak character, according to Machiavelli, which makes Maximilian susceptible to influence by his advisors, his brokers, who lead him to make very bad decisions. So kindness in a ruler, according to Machiavelli, is a liability. What do you think of that? Machiavelli was most inspired by this man, Cesare Borgia, whom he called the ideal leader. Cesare Borgia was the son of the infamous Pope Alexander VI. Cesare ruled an area of north-central Italy, and he also used treachery, deceit, and murder even to acquire power and maintain power. This while he was even a cardinal in the church. Machiavelli saw Cesare Borgia's brutal tactics firsthand. And Machiavelli advised rulers still to do as Cesare Borgia did, to do whatever political necessity requires, even if it is morally questionable or downright immoral. During a visit with Cesare to discuss relations with Florence, Machiavelli witnessed as Cesare lured his enemies to the city of Senigallia with gifts and promises of friendship and reconciliation. And once they arrived, had them all assassinated. Ultimately, even Cesare would succumb to ill fortune when his father, Pope Alexander VI, became ill and died. Cesare died a few years after the death of his father at the young age of 32. Despite Cesare Borgia's premature demise, Machiavelli believed that a strong leader like him was exactly what Florence needed to raise morale, to unite the people, and raise the city-state's prominence to its former glory. So here are some key points that Machiavelli learned while observing Cesare Borgia. Political pragmatism. Machiavelli admired his ability to adapt to changing situations and make calculated decisions to maintain power, even if they were considered morally questionable. Fear over love. Machiavelli believed that a ruler should be feared rather than loved, and Cesare's ruthless tactics exemplifies this principle. The ends justify the means. By using deception and violence to achieve political stability, Cesare Borgia embodied the idea that the ends, power and maintaining it, sometimes justify the means, a key aspect of Machiavellianism. It's important to remember the political landscape of Renaissance Italy when trying to grasp Machiavelli's perspective. There were constant power struggles and shifting alliances. New popes and new monarchs inflicted new agendas, and every city and its rulers were constantly adjusting to new power dynamics. So while Machiavellian is often associated with ruthless and immoral behavior, some scholars argue that Machiavelli's work was more nuanced. His works advocate for political realism and understanding the need for a ruler to sometimes act decisively even if it meant sacrificing some moral considerations to maintain stability. In a letter to a friend, Machiavelli wrote, "If I have been a little too punctual in describing these monsters in all their lineaments and colors, I hope mankind will know them, the better to avoid them, my treatise being both a satire against them and a true character of them." Machiavelli even warned about leaders who use a call to unity to gain power. The call for unity often leads to despotism. It is a mask, often, for the suppression of opposition. Think about that in our current political climate as well. Over the centuries that followed the publishing of the Prince, the principles it espoused would trigger outrage as well as admiration and establish Machiavelli as a controversial and revolutionary political thinker. Also in the Prince, Machiavelli writes, "How we live is so different from how we ought to live that he who studies what ought to be done rather than what is done will learn the way to his downfall rather than to his preservation." Let that sink in a moment. In 1559, all of Machiavelli's works were placed on the Catholic Church's Index of Prohibited Books. The recently formed Protestant Church also condemned The Prince, and it was banned in Elizabethan England. Nonetheless, the book was widely read, and its author's name became synonymous with cunning and unscrupulous behavior. When considering the tumultuous times of constant battle and political intrigue of Machiavelli's era, it's really a miracle we had a Renaissance at all. So before we issue judgment on this matter of power, let us consider that perhaps some who gain power by whatever means may also bring a great amount of cultural riches and civic good, like what you see here, which came to us from Cosimo de' Medici and Pope Julius II. So perhaps the enigma of power does not call for an either-or judgment, but perhaps a both-and solution. But you must decide for yourself. Or perhaps in our final presentation in the series next week, it will help clarify this topic further. I know it's not an easy one. All right, thank you very much for your attention. Very complex issue, but I am very curious about your perspectives. And also, if you have any questions, you can offer them now. The floor is open. So don't forget to unmute yourself and then mute yourself back when your comment or question is done. All right, go ahead. Looking forward to hearing your responses.
Wherever